start by acknowledging that some projects, but not all projects, rely on some other people changing their behaviour. So some types of projects generate their benefits by doing some actions that are intended to change the behaviour, say, of people in the general public or people in the private sector, or maybe even other government organisations in some cases. And so if this project that you're evaluating is going to generate any benefits, then it's going to have to succeed in changing the behaviour of those other people or organisations. And so you're going to have to make some judgment about the extent to which, the most likely extent to which, you will change other people's behaviour that need to be changed. I'd acknowledge that not every project is like this. If your project is just, I'm from the government and I'm going to build a big fence, or I'm going to build a big bit of concrete, it clearly doesn't, well, it may not necessarily rely on behaviour change. I guess if the concrete is a freeway, then maybe it does depend on behaviour to some degree, because it depends on how many people use it. But anyway, it's not always the case that behaviour change is an issue, but it sometimes is. So here's my comments about accounting for adoption or behaviour change. First of all, identify all the changes in behaviour that are required to achieve the targets of the project. Think about who it is who has to change their behaviour. Predict realistic levels of behaviour change, and then later on we'll come to how you do that. That's Mary's question. And that would include who has to change and how much, and then where they have to change, and then how much change is realistic to expect, somewhere between 0 and 100% change. And then what are the benefits given that pattern of adoption? So I'm sort of thinking about behaviour change here in the sense of there's some level of behaviour change that would give you 100% of the benefits that you're expecting could happen. All right, and then how much of that do you get? So my approach, because I think this is actually another area where you can get to over-optimism by not accounting well for behaviour change. So the way I do that is I make it explicit. In my usual approach, where this is an issue, I start by estimating the benefits, assuming 100% adoption. I sort of take adoption out of the story, and then I'll say, okay, well, now I know what the peak or potential level of benefits are. Now I need to worry about scaling them down by estimating the realistic adoption level for each benefit, or an average for all benefits. So I could get a different level of adoption for each type of benefit, or I can make an assumption that I'm just going to assume simply applies to all of them. And then I'll scale down the potential benefits to reflect that, what level of adoption I'm realistically expecting. Okay, so in doing that, I'm implicitly defining this thing, a variable A. A is the level of adoption or compliance as a proportion of the level needed to achieve the project's goals or potential benefits. And a level of A less than 1 does not mean that the project generates no benefits, or at least not necessarily. It might for some projects, but in this case, probably not. So for example, if A equals 0.5, it implies that adoption is only half the level needed to achieve the benefits that you've set out to achieve. Now, if you think about the way I've worded that, it doesn't necessarily mean that half the people have adopted, okay? Because you may be able to achieve half the benefits with less than half the adoption, perhaps, right? It could be nonlinear, or it could be sigmoidal, right? Who knows? And I guess I'd acknowledge that it's actually often quite difficult to know what the shape of this curve is. This curve is the relationship between A up to 1, which gives you the maximum possible level of adoption, and B, which is the benefits. So maybe it's sigmoidal, maybe it's got decreasing marginal benefits, maybe it's got increasing marginal benefits, I don't know. It's going to be quite project specific. Maybe it's just linear. And quite often, I would say this is one of the issues that we really struggle to get good information about. We're often making pretty heroic assumptions. I work a lot in environmental projects, and I would say this is often the thing we know very little about. And so we often fall back on an assumption. I'm often relatively comfortable making an assumption that it's a straight line, because on the basis that I don't reckon that's much worse than any other assumption I could make, because the level of knowledge we have about it is so poor. But that's a judgment that you as the analyst will need to make. Ideally, you'd want to have access to modelling results or some empirical real-world measurements that would help you get this. But if you don't have it, you're going to have to either make a judgment yourself or get some experts to make a judgment for you. All right, how do we predict realistic adoption levels? Inevitably, predicting good predictions require knowledge about the practice being advocated. That's one thing you need to understand, the practice itself. What behaviour are you trying to promote? So you need to understand what benefits that practice or behaviour would generate for the users, if any. It may not generate any. What costs they would face in implementing it, and perhaps there might even be ongoing costs if they've implemented it. How risky is it for the users? How complex is it for users? And how compatible is it with their existing behaviours or systems or business? So if you've ever read research on the adoption of new practices in agriculture, you probably recognise that list as being sort of high up on the list of factors that are often found to be important drivers of behaviour change or adoption in agriculture. And I think it's not just agriculture. I think they're common sense factors that would be pretty generally relevant. Then the other thing you need to understand is the people who you're hoping will adopt it. And so it's interesting. I observed that when people study adoption or behaviour change, there's often a lot of emphasis on the people side of this and less emphasis on the behaviour itself or the technology or the practice that's being adopted. My strong view is that they're both important, and actually they're probably about both equally important. So I get quite frustrated with a lot of the literature on behaviour that ignores the technology and focuses primarily on the people. But the people are important, don't get me wrong, and so you need to have knowledge about how much they care about the benefits that it will be generated, if they have access to the resources required to generate the benefit, to adopt the behaviour, what their attitudes to risk are, their strength of community networks that might help them in adopting the behaviour change, the community attitudes towards this practice, which might influence them. Okay. So that's all very general. What about doing this quantitatively? If you want to include this in a BCA, you've got to have some numbers. So how can you get that? Well, you need to know, well, perhaps you can pull together some evidence and opinion about the current levels of adoption of the practice you're interested in, whether or not there's been effort to encourage that behaviour already. If it's been promoted a lot in the past and the adoption level is still low, that tells you something. It tells you something about how hard it is to get this thing adopted. And so it tells you something about what you should be assuming. I would not be being optimistic about the adoption of that practice by this project unless this project is pretty special and pretty different from the previous efforts that have been made to adopt it. Okay. Conversely, if the adoption level of this practice is already really high, then you want to make sure you're not attributing high adoption to this current project because it's already highly adopted, right? So what adoption is already out there is going to be important in the judgments that you make. And of course, this is going to be related to the costs and benefits of the practice, which is sort of what I was talking about a couple of slides ago when I was saying, what are the characteristics of this practice? You might find that there are existing papers or reports that help you make these judgments. You might not, in which case you might find you have to conduct workshops or surveys of citizens or businesses or of experts in behaviour. You might not have time or resources to do all that. You might resort to expert judgments to tell you what level of adoption should you assume. Or you might just be an economist and look at the financial analysis of the practice and base your assumptions about behaviour entirely on that and, adjust it accordingly to the other thinking that you've done that I've suggested. All right, so you can see that I'm doing a fair bit of what you might call it hand waving here. I guess I'm sort of trying to throw up all of the factors that you need to think about, but recognizing that you may not have high quality information about all of these factors. Hopefully you have. If you haven't, then recognizing that the information is important and thinking about how you get the best information you can. Now that was about adoption by people. Adoption by other organisations, as I said, could also be important. The project might need cooperation by other organisations. So for example, a project that's being run by the Department of Agriculture might rely on the Department of Environment cooperating, such as by enforcing regulations that are their responsibility. And I've actually done a BCA that was exactly like that. And so you then got to say, well, what are the chances of the Department of Environment actually enforcing the regulations? And so then you've got, that's probably quite case specific. You want to look at what's the relationship between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environment? What's the Department of Environment's history of enforcement of these types of regulations? In the case that I was looking at, it was pretty poor. They were just letting it go. And so we had to make a judgment and scale down the benefits accordingly. In that case, what we did was we multiplied the potential benefits by a probability, which was a judgment call, that the Department of Environment would actually enforce the regulations. Okay, timing is also an issue, of course, when you're talking about adoption and behaviour change. It's the timing of adoption is one of the reasons why benefits are not delivered immediately. This is a really striking graph because it shows one of the most successful ever adoption stories in agriculture. It shows adoption of zero-till in agriculture, but even for zero-till, which ends up being adopted by 90% or more of croppers, it still took 30 years from when that technology first became available to when it reached maximum adoption. So the time lags can be really large, and that needs to be accounted for as well. When you're doing a BCA, as I said, I often approximate the relationship between A and the benefits with something other than a smooth curve. And the same is true when I'm looking at the relationship between time and adoption. And for different BCAs, in different cases, I've used any of, or not all, any of these options, you know, a smooth line, a sudden jump, or a step, a couple of steps. And depending on how important your project is and how accurate your information is, one or the other of those might be sufficient. Okay, that is my prepared blurb. Now just jump back to Mary's question. Advice about tools that can help predict adoption. Okay, well, I'm glad you asked, Mary, because I was part of the team that developed Adopt. So I always wince a bit when people refer to it as CSIRO's Adopt model. It's not just CSIRO's Adopt model, it's partly my Adopt model as well. But anyway, CSIRO is the custodian and host of the Adopt model. And we developed that because we were unaware of any other practically useful tool for predicting adoption. And so if you are predicting adoption for agriculture, my advice is use Adopt. Because I think it's the only tool out there for agriculture or for agricultural related projects. For non-agricultural projects, there may be a tool out there, but I'm not aware of one, and not of that type. You know, not of a sort of a simple desktop tool where, based on some judgment-based questions, you can make a preliminary estimate of adoption. You know, I think you're going to be, other than Adopt, you're going to be having to rely on the sorts of more subjective, expert-based, judgment-based approaches that I've sort of talked about in that presentation. So I'm sorry, but that's just how it is.